Alright, third segment. I'm new to this YouTube stuff and trying to understand how to process the data. Hopefully, like I said about the free conference call, that the YouTube process will be a little better next week as well. So that brings us to verse 26. God presented him to demonstrate his righteousness at the present time, so that he would be righteous and declare righteous the one who has faith in Jesus. Verse 26 repeats much of verse 25. We'll remember from previous studies that seeing something repeated creates emphasis. It's showing the importance. So what he's saying is, this is important, so let me say it again. He also elaborates further. If there were any question of what faith, he declares righteous the one who has faith in Jesus. So the faith is clearly, and to make it plain, he clarifies, I'm talking about faith in Jesus. There's a question on page 38 of our lesson here. Let's see if a couple of questions there. All right. How would you explain Jesus' atoning sacrifice for our sins to a person who is not a believer? You know, as I thought about that, I realized that our culture is different from some other cultures in the world. And I thought about actually it was a cartoon that I watched with the children about a sailor and a friend, and it's taking place in the Mediterranean area, and I think it was Syracuse was the particular location. And the friend is a prince, and the sailor is pretty much a thief. But in the storyline, the thief is accused of thievery, which is something that is typical of a thief. But the prince, who is his friend, he comes to him and he talks to him, and the thief denies taking the stuff. And because he is his friend, and also there's some underlying themes that go into the storyline, but because he's a friend, he goes to the judgment, or to the trial rather, and at the trial they pass judgment on the thief. And the prince, who is the thief's friend, he insists on the right of substitution, which means his head is now on the chopping block instead of his friend. Here in our country, the person who's guilty always pays, or in theory they always pay the penalty for their crime. But not so in some older cultures. There was an opportunity for someone to pay the penalty. And that is what we see in this, is that as we're talking about this, there's a little bit of a gap. How can Jesus pay for the crimes that I have done? Well, it's because God is the judge, and God has made that provision that Jesus can. So how do we explain that? For me, I would look to popular culture opportunities to illustrate, just as I did there. The next part of our question is, what illustrations or analogies could you use to explain unfamiliar words like sacrifice? Well, people understand in our culture that you make sacrifices. You don't do things, or you don't buy things, or you sell something in order to get something else. But they don't understand the blood sacrifice unless they've been brought up and taught such things. They don't understand the blood sacrifice that we've been talking about. So if we look at the skins, those skins back in the garden when Adam and Eve had sinned, God slew an animal to cover their flesh and protect them in the skins, in the life of another animal. How else might we look at that? You know, I think it's in our culture, it may take some talking through. It may take some examples. But I think the main point would be that Jesus is paying a penalty for something that we can't pay the penalty for. So whether or not they understand all of the details, they understand that they cannot live a perfect and sinless life to pay for their, or to avoid judgment. Moving on to verses 27 through 31. Where then is boasting? It is excluded. By what kind of law? By one of works? No, on the contrary, by a law of faith. For we conclude that a person is justified by faith apart from the works of the law. Or is God the God of the Jews only? Is he not the God of the Gentiles too? Yes, of Gentiles too. Since there is one God who will justify the circumcised by faith and the uncircumcised through faith, do we then nullify the law through faith? Absolutely not. On the contrary, we uphold the law. What are you doing to get to heaven? I sat in a Sunday school class years ago in a slightly different denomination, and that question, how are you going to get to heaven? And they said, a lot of good, clean living. But that would give you an opportunity to boast. There's only one way to heaven. Page 39. Our writer, he says, Jesus did everything necessary for our salvation. All that is left is to accept his gift by faith. Since he has done all the work, we have no room to brag about our own goodness. Paul told the Romans that Jesus' death and resurrection leaves no room for boasting. The wording points toward Israel's pride as God's chosen people. Paul used a series of rhetorical questions to show how such spiritual pride is empty. It is inappropriate to brag about a gift that is given, not earned. Plus, this gift is available to everyone. The law of faith, total dependence on Jesus, stands in contrast to the works of the law. Dependence on ourselves, thus bragging on Jesus and his free gift, should replace boasting in our feeble efforts. We stand accused before a perfect judge because we put our faith in his Son, the judge